Good afternoon and welcome to this breakout session on the topic of peace and goodwill for the sake of mission. My colleagues on the Synod pastoral staff and I are all addressing topics that arise directly from that portion of the model constitution for congregations that describe the duties of congregation councils. And so this breakout session takes a look at, if you want to look it up, C1204F, which reads that one of the duties of a congregation council is, and I quote, to promote a congregational climate of peace and goodwill, and as differences and conflicts arise, to endeavor to foster mutual understanding. So first, a couple of introductory comments. I want to be very clear that this is not a breakout session on the much broader topic of conflict in congregations. The reason it's not that is that I think that all congregations that are alive have a certain amount of conflict going on all the time. In fact, I would go so far as to suggest we might list conflict as one of the marks of a living, growing, active congregation. In fact, if a congregation never has any conflict, or say they never have any conflict, chances are they may be dead already or in the dying process. Living organizations, like living organisms, including congregations, inevitably have a certain amount of what I like to call garden variety conflict happening most of the time. Often in the months of January or February, I will get verbal reports on how congregational annual meetings have gone, and fairly frequently I'll hear something like this: "Oh, Bishop, we had a great annual meeting this year. It only took 20 minutes, start to finish, to get it over with. There was no conflict, no debate, not even that much discussion. Calm waters, clear sailing, things went like clockwork. It was a very good annual meeting," or so I am told. And when I hear that, on the inside, I'm usually shouting, "No, no, no!" I worry about such congregations. Now, I better explain that, because it's true, I take no joy in angry, contentious annual meetings that leave everyone walking away feeling hurt or angry or frustrated. But an annual meeting that is judged good simply because it was short and no one said much of anything, I wonder if that congregation is really okay. Does such peacefulness really reflect faithfulness in such a congregation? Surely, there must be something happening in a church that is important enough, vital enough, that at least some folks want to talk about it or have a respectful debate about it or express themselves in some way. At least take a vote or two and indicate how they feel about moving ahead with some new set of goals or a fresh program or a risky mission venture. So, this is not a session about conflict in congregations. This is a session about unhealthy, seriously harmful, destructive conflict in congregations. And that leads me to the first of a couple of times that we're going to stop this DVD and give you some moments to discuss a couple of questions. And here are the questions. How can you tell when garden variety conflict in a congregation has become hurtful, harmful, or destructive? What are 2 or 3 signs or symptoms of a congregation whose level of conflict is starting to endanger the character, the mission, or the ministry of this part of the body of Christ? So please stop the DVD now and engage in some conversation with one another about those questions. Thanks for taking some time for discussion with one another. Because I'm curious about what you talked about in your discussion time, I'm asking the local facilitator to take some notes and send those notes to me in the week to come. What I want to do now is to share with you some of my own thoughts about when garden variety conflict turns ugly, harmful, potentially destructive in a congregation. What are the marks or symptoms of that happening? So here goes. In harmful conflict, the temperature in the room goes up. People may even say they're getting hot or hot under the collar. And what that really means for the most part is that they are starting to engage in highly emotional responses with one another. Second thing that happens is that conversation turns combative in tone. Anxiety builds up, people become uncomfortable and start to either come out fighting or clam up because they fear conflict. And the result is that meaningful conversation starts to get shut down. Thirdly, instead of focusing on issues before the congregation, now or in the future, folks start dwelling on personalities. They begin to say things and take things personally. Listen for vocabulary changes that might sound like this. I'm deeply offended by what you just said, instead of saying, I respectfully disagree with your opinion. There becomes a lot of rehashing of old gripes, grievances, and battles. Fourthly, cracks in the unity of the congregation start to become visible. Factions start to form. Some persons or groups of persons might engage in bullying, threatening, gossiping, visibly withdrawing from the life of the church, or responding to one another in other inappropriate ways. Fifth, folks start to feel and talk as though their congregation is losing something precious to them, losing their sense of family or togetherness or simple basic care and concern for one another. Sixth, the climate of a congregation starts to become deadly serious. Smiles become rare. Laughter is seldom heard. And seventh, and for me this is the most important mark of a conflict that has gone bad, is that the congregation becomes paralyzed by this conflict. People start thinking about the conflict and nothing else. The conflict shuts down the normal functioning of a church. And worst of all, the very worst of all, is that God's mission gets put on the back burner for a while. I'm going to add an eighth sign of conflict becoming destructive. In all likelihood, it's at this point when those leaders of the congregation who aren't totally consumed by the conflict realize that this congregation is at a point that it can't fix itself. So they raise the possibility of bringing in some outside help. For example, the Synod staff or a consultant who deals with destructive conflict. So I suggest to you those, along with what you talked about, are some of the signs to look for and be aware of when garden variety conflict is starting to turn harmful and destructive. Now I'd like us to move on and think a little bit about the causes of congregational conflicts that turn destructive. When folks in the leadership of the church realize that they need help, and if I may, assuming that the congregation hasn't already fallen apart in factions and resignations and withdrawals of a critical mass of members, which fortunately doesn't happen that often, one of the first signs of returning health is to a sharply conflicted church is that members will sincerely ask one another, how did we let this happen? How did we get to this point? In other words, members will want to learn more about the causes of their particular congregational conflict. And this entails a willingness to look back at their recent history and maybe even at their more long-term previous history. And at this point, sometimes someone will say, well, we don't want to wallow in the past, to which I respond, no, it's not about wallowing in the past. It is about genuinely seeking insight into the critical moments when choices were made that led either toward health or sickness as a church. It's about identifying forks in the road where different decisions could have yielded healthier results. It's about being honest about perhaps long-term patterns that have been allowed to bring the congregation to the point where their future seems imperiled. So this leads me to our second discussion question this afternoon, after which we'll again stop the DVD. Here's the question. What, in your experience, are some of the typical causes of destructive conflict in a congregation? We've already talked about the marks or the symptoms, how to recognize that conflict is happening, but let's go deeper now. Where do you identify the causes of destructive conflict? So once again, please pause the DVD, and we'll return shortly to conclude this session. Well, thanks again for taking some time to engage one another in discussion. We know that that's very important. And once again, I'm asking your local facilitator to jot down some of your responses and share them with me so that I can learn some things from you. Here are some of the causes, some of the behaviors or other realities that I regularly see in congregations whose conflict has gone from manageable to unmanageable. First of all, there is often a pervasive sense of denial and or scapegoating. One thing that can actually drive a conflict is the tendency by some to deny that the conflict exists. So some people know that they're in conflict and others try to deny it, and that very denial feeds the conflict. Or if everyone more or less admits that conflict is happening, destructive conflict, they may start to look for quick fixes or blame that is focused on a scapegoat who often turns out to be the pastor. A second cause of destructive conflict is a breakdown in effective communication within the congregation. This is noticed when we realize people are simply not talking to one another, afraid or unable to speak directly, openly, honestly. And similarly, they also stop listening to one another and hearing not only the words that are being said, but the emotions, the concerns that are behind those words. A third cause of destructive conflict is when we allow unhealthy triangling to take place. This is a term you may or may not be familiar with, but it is pervasive in all of our work with conflict. What is triangling? It looks like this. Instead of routinely speaking directly with a person with whom you need to talk, maybe a person who troubles you or you have a gripe with, you talk, instead of talking directly with that person, you talk to a third party about the person who concerns you. The common term for this is gossip, but this creation of these unhealthy triangles where we're talking about one another but not with one another is a chief cause of destructive conflict in churches. Fourthly, a cause for conflict is the existence of secrets in a congregation. And this happens all the time. we on the Synod staff enter into a congregation and immediately we start hearing about the fact that there's secrets that are being kept. There are anonymous letters that are being written. Clandestine meetings are being held. It becomes common to exclude one or more persons from key discussions. And once again, often the pastor is the odd one out in this regard. Occasionally, and actually recently, I've seen this, some rump group in the church takes it upon themselves to start making decisions on behalf of the whole church council or on behalf of the whole church. So secrecy is another cause of destructive conflict. Fifth, you can even start to detect hints of anarchy breaking loose in some churches that are moving toward destructive conflict. We see this when congregational leaders, even council members, ignore or flaunt the congregation's governing documents, your constitution and bylaws. They try to cut corners thinking if they could just somehow reduce the pain or somehow remove a troublemaker, the conflict will go away. This is a very dangerous step that can happen in a church that's getting consumed by destructive conflict. And we on the Synod staff will always encourage congregational leaders to follow their governing documents. And in fact, members of churches will expect that of their leaders. Sixth, another cause of destructive conflict is the eruption of what I call crazy-making behavior among the members of the church. That includes things like people just walking away, withdrawing, the pain's too great, and suddenly they are contributing to the problem by not being involved in seeking a solution. That involves churches where some members start to use their support, be it prayer support, personal support, or financial support, to pull the strings, so to speak, of what's happening in the church. One of the worst forms of crazy-making behaviors is when any person or group of persons issues ultimatums to the rest of the church. If this doesn't happen, well, then we're going to do this. And along with that, two other crazy-making behaviors. Bullying, which is a word that's come into use largely out of school settings involving young people, but it happens in adult communities as well. And finally, crazy-making behavior is when we allow anxiety to simply run amok in a congregation. Anxiety will always be present in any group of people, but when we don't monitor it and when we let it run amok, it wreaks havoc in churches. A seventh area of causation for destructive conflicts is the lack of imagination that starts to happen when people who are already being drawn into a destructive conflict lose their capacity to think creatively. And the irony and the pain of this is that they start to lose precisely what they need to get out of that destructive conflict, the ability to think imaginatively, to be playful, to dream. Number 8, another cause that makes garden variety conflict destructive is when people stop simply speaking for themselves. Instead of taking adult responsibility for ourselves and what we think and feel and need to say, instead of speaking for themselves, members might routinely start saying things like, well, a lot of people are saying, fill in the blank. Those are just some of the causes of destructive conflict that I have observed in congregations. Before I leave this section, I simply want to note that these are dynamics that I think can and do move congregations from healthy conflict to unhealthy conflict, regardless of whatever presenting issue or topic supposedly triggered the conflict. Triggers can be things like a change in how the congregation operates, It can involve a proposed building project or a remodeling project, a capital campaign, the calling of a new pastor or the hiring of a new staff person, or some issue in the denomination or the synod that has everyone up in arms. Those I call the topics that can set off a conflictual reality in a church. But those are not as important, I think, as the emotional processes that I've just described that describe how people actually deal with whatever the issue may be. Those who work out of a family systems theory of understanding how groups like congregations operate are, I think, readily say that it is hardly ever the topic itself that produces the conflict. It is the emotional processes that people engage in while dealing with the issue. I want to move to the final section now of this presentation and get to what you're probably longing for. We've spent probably more than enough time in identifying signs of destructive conflict and mentioning some causes to be aware of. Now, how do we help a church recover from destructive conflict? And in the process, how do we also adopt some preventive measures that will help prevent destructive conflict in the future? They're kind of one and the same. So once again, I have a list of a number of ideas about how we can start to get the recovery going and how we can rebuild the congregation's internal life in such a way that we hopefully prevent future destructive conflicts. So the first thing I just want to mention is intervention. Most serious congregational conflicts will start to turn around only with some intervention from outside the congregation. And this, I want to underscore, is intervention that is recognized and requested by the Congregation Council. It is in this regard that we who serve you on the Synod staff are usually first responders, which means that we are the ones who may be invited in first to help members understand what is happening and to help leaders identify possible courses of action. Every once in a while, not always, but every once in a while, our recommendations might include a recommendation that the congregation consider working with a consultant or a consulting group. You need to know that the Synod staff doesn't charge for our work. That's part of our partnership together because we're church together. But if we recommend a consultant or a consulting group, there will be a financial charge. And I've noticed, of course, that often in this time of tight congregational budgets, that is not a welcome word that people are excited about. It can even kind of feed the conflict once again. But I've also noted that at some level people get it, that they need some outside help, and somehow they're ready to produce the financial resources to make that outside help happen, because they'd rather do that than risk losing their church. Second area that we almost always have to talk about together when we're dealing with destructive conflict is that usually there are some leadership issues that need to be addressed. Often, as one of the first steps in recovering from a destructive conflict, changes in leadership may need to take place. The pastor, for example, may reach the conclusion that he or she can no longer serve there, and the pastor may be offered a negotiated resignation, and we on the Synod staff can help this. Or maybe other staff persons might need to be negotiated out. And sometimes one or more elected congregational leaders may resign or be transitioned out of their office by the Congregation Council. If the pastor or other staff members leave, the congregation will need some help to put together interim ministry, and we on the Synod staff can help you. Third area of trying to remedy, recover, and prevent destructive conflicts is to pay very close attention to pastoral care and ongoing Christian formation. The pastor or perhaps more likely the interim pastor who comes in after the pastor has left, may well focus for a time on very intentional visitation, or offering special worship services for congregational healing, or inviting everyone into a season of prayer and reconciliation with one another, encouraging all members to avail themselves of the means of grace, hearing God's word, coming to the Lord's Supper, and also perhaps coming to individual or group confession and absolution. Here I simply want to state something that is probably obvious to you, but we do sometimes forget. People who live within the regular rhythm of confession and absolution, hearing God's forgiveness, have the best resource for recovering from destructive congregational conflict. And hopefully doing that will also lead people to want to reacquaint themselves with key biblical passages like Matthew 18:15 through 20, which I believe should be the bedrock of our learning about this issue of conflict and reconciliation for all confirmed members of the congregation. A fourth area where we can talk about recovery and prevention is kind of a broad area, and I have several subpoints here, but I would simply call this building resilience and laying plans for prevention. Peter Steinke, in his Creating Healthy Congregations study guide, speaks of three characteristics that are shared by congregations that possess a sense of coherence that allows them to manage conflict, to keep conflict from becoming destructive. And those three characteristics are meaningfulness, comprehensibility, and manageability. First of all, subpoint now to point 4, meaningfulness. Congregations, members have a sense of purpose for their church and are committed to it. We know this to be true, that the healthiest churches know why God has put them there and what God is calling them to do. And often that gets forgotten in the midst of destructive conflict. Healthy congregations take up the challenges that come to them and shape their destiny under God. So in this regard, this factor of meaningfulness, I think, yields the encouragement that in a time of recovering from conflict, members of the church should spend time recovering their sense of purpose for their congregation. This both aids them in their recovery. Oh yeah, that's what we're here to do, not fight with one another, but to pursue the purpose we think God has called us to pursue. It aids not only recovery from destructive conflict, but it is one of the best antidotes to help prevent future conflict, to stay mission-focused. Second subpoint, what Steinke calls comprehensibility. What he says about this characteristic is that folks in a congregation have a framework for making sense of what is happening to them. Healthy interaction and clear communication are taken for granted, maybe because they're taught and retaught and expected throughout the life cycle of a church. People see change as natural, not something that's unnatural and to be avoided. Decisions in healthy congregations are made on the basis of clarity, not necessarily certainty or unanimity on everything, but clarity about where a critical mass of the congregation strongly believes the congregation needs to go. I believe that exposing people to the insights of family systems theory as applied to congregational systems is very helpful here. In terms of recovery and prevention of future destructive conflict, some congregations have discussed and adopted having a congregational behavioral covenant. And I have some examples of that which I will try to provide for you through your participation in today's session. Thirdly, there's this category of manageability that Peter Steinke mentions. Church folk don't act like victims or complain about how unfairly they have been treated in a congregation that handles conflict in a healthy way. Rather, they recognize the gifts and tools available to them, and they respond thoughtfully to the challenges that confront them. I believe, building on what Dr. Steinke says, that a part of this manageability factor is that in a healthier church, anxiety is recognized, monitored, kept in check, as opposed to running amok. And that's why I strongly advise all congregations to engage in some sort of comprehensive adult education together using a resource like Healthy Congregations by Peter Steinke. For sure, the called, hired, elected, appointed leaders of a church should be expected to complete Healthy Congregations training. And I will, in some ancillary materials you'll receive during this session, provide you with ways to get a hold of those materials and receive such training. Well, that brings us to the end of this breakout session. Again, I thank you for your engagement together with this afternoon. I want to just conclude with 3 quick comments. First of all, you know we have just barely opened up this huge, broad, but very important topic. One thing I know for sure is that destructive conflict in a congregation is never addressed properly when we pretend it isn't there. So please accept my thanks for coming to engage with this topic this afternoon. Secondly, if time permits now, depending upon how much time you spent in conversation over the earlier questions, I do invite you to discuss 2 final questions. First, what is one takeaway that you are bringing out of this breakout session? What did you learn that you'll be thinking about as you drive home this afternoon or later in the evening? And then secondly, I would appreciate it if you'd talk with one another about what question or questions you still have about this issue of destructive conflict. And again, I'm going to ask your facilitator to collect your responses and share them with me. So finally, thirdly, thank you again so much for participating in this session, and God bless you as you help lead your congregation in a spirit of peace and goodwill for the sake of God's mission. God bless you all.